just want you to know he lives in Canada. He's an award-winning playwright, actor, and teacher. He's written about 22 novels now. The French Executioner was a runner-up for Steel Dagger for Thrillers UK, so that's an important award. He's written Jack Absolute, and that's from the, what's the name of the play, the restoration play?
The Rivals.
The Rival. So actually, I did makeup for that in college, I'll have to say. Picture. And Vlad is one of the ones about really cool. And then one of the ones that has really gotten a lot of things is Shakespeare's Rebel, which he's done for play. And he actually was one of the big deals in Vancouver, BC is Bard on the Beach. So that novel was adapted for that. That's a huge thing. And he's won a whole lot of awards. He's done everything from fantasy, and I've read some of his YA fantasy, which are a lot of fun. And then the most recent one is about his mom and dad. Literally, it's kind of based on their story, which is a great love story. So this is the Canadian picture. It also is published in the US with a very similar cover. And it's a wonderful read. So Chris and I met first, I think we first met in Denver at the Historical Novel Society. And I was walking down the hall and he was in a room talking about the globe, but he was doing To Be or Not to Be. And I stopped because I was just blown away. It was like he was having this conversation. It was so natural and it was just wonderful. And then I kept running into him in Surrey and another conference, I think in Portland. And then he started asking me questions because I was writing, I was working on the Quisling Factor, and I had these spy maps at Western Washington University, which is just up the hill from me. And we just started chatting, and that's when I found out his mother was in the Resistance. So I'm so really honored that Chris has been my narrator for all three of my books. He just has, you know, everyone wants to get their book on the film, but I think being narrated by Chris is just as close as you could get. So I'm really thrilled.
Thank you.
And he's a wonderful, you know, he just got back from hiking in Turkey and Syria. Posting stuff, so he's quite active. So I'll just turn it over to you now. So, and we'll see what he has to say. I'm really excited.
Great. Oh, Janet, that's a very lovely interview. Though if anyone's particularly worried about me hiking in Syria, it wasn't actually Syria, but close. I was in the Lycian Way on southern Turkey for a while, and then I was drifting through the Balkans, in fact, but I just got back about 2 weeks ago. And people always say, oh, you're researching a new book. And I go, A, no, and B, always, because, you know, obviously I'm always researching a book. So, but I don't know how. I'm not researching a book specifically on the Balkans, but I'm sure some of the stuff I learned along the way there will play out in the future. But anyway, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this forum. It's exciting to be here on a Sunday morning. I live on Salt Spring Island, which is it's the Canadian equivalent of the San Juan Islands, which Janet spends a lot of time on, I know, is a historical narrator there and stuff. So yeah, I'll give you a little more background on me, I suppose, because it'll factor in to what I'm going to tell you. I've sort of ceased calling myself anything specifically. I wear so many hats now. That I've really just narrowed it down to the single hat is storyteller. I've always been a storyteller. As a child, I was that kid who got all the neighbor kids out playing, you know, pirates and Zorro and all that stuff. And I was one saying, you'll be this and you'll be that. And I was that guy. And that was in Los Angeles, actually. I lived in Los Angeles till I was 6 years old, though I was born in Canada, in Toronto. I come from a family of storytellers. My dad was an actor and a bit of a writer as well. All four grandparents were actors, two in England and then in the US. My paternal grandfather, Cecil Humphries, was actually a very well-known 1930s and 40s stage primarily, but did quite a lot of film as well. He was in Olivier's Wuthering Heights and The Razor's Edge with Tyrone Power and things like that. My Norwegian family, which will come into further play shortly when I tell you about the book, and my mum. Carl, my grandfather, was an actor, a writer, quite a successful writer and a painter. and my grandmother Betsy was a very successful actress in Norway in the 20s and 30s, and then a bit after the war as well. So really, there was a what I call the curse of blood involved. You know, I had to become an actor as well, really, even though my mother was desperate for me not to be, having married one and grown up in the household of another. And so I was aiming for the law, but got distracted by getting casted in the lead in the school play, and suddenly found, yes, this is what I meant to do. So I had a great career as an actor. I don't want to really talk about it in the past tense, because technically I'm still an actor. I was performing some Shakespeare just the other day here on Salt Spring Island, in fact, in a little show. But my main focus after I was a pretty successful actor when I was in my 20s and 30s, and I'm just going to share a photo. I hope you're all sitting down, because or not of faint heart, because there's this going on here. This was my starring role in a biblical Roman epic in the mid-80s in the US. It was called Anno Domini. I don't know if any of you remember it. It was a big mini series.
I remember that.
You do, yeah. So this was me in the mid-80s. So there you go. My days as a gladiator. Yeah, that was one of the big roles I played. I won't leave that up too long. Yeah, and so I had a good career, but I always the problem with being an actor, of course, is that you're so out of control. You have to wait for someone to give you a job, or give you the chance to be creative, and that can be great. But you're always telling someone else's story, and I had so many stories in my head. So I eventually got around to telling them. I began as a playwright, was reasonably successful in Canada as a playwright to begin with, won a couple of competitions and stuff, and plays were produced. But what I always really wanted to do was write historical fiction. That was where I lived as a child. That's my background reading. I loved history. Preferably with swords involved. One of the other gigs I have had in my life is as a fight choreographer. I was a fencer at school. It was my main sport. So I always loved. So I became an actor so I could jump around with bladed weaponry, essentially. So playing a gladiator in a biblical Roman epic was kind of the peak of all that. And then yes, but then later on the acting started not. Yeah, I mean, tailing off, I suppose. It's a youth-driven industry, so I was I was kind of popular when I was young, and then started to get less work, and really wanted to just start telling my own stories. So eventually went from the plays to writing my first novel, The French Executioner, which was about the man who killed Anne Boleyn. I don't know if any of you know that story. It's mad. I've just reissued it, actually. It's you can get it, the 20th anniversary edition now, which I can't quite believe. And that's a sort of mad book, but I did pretty well with it straight away, and then followed a series. I got a series of book commissions from I was living in England at the time, from my English publisher, and that then ran through all sorts of different. My problem with, I think, publishers is that I tend to jump around a bit, genres, periods. I think they'd prefer it if I just wrote one thing all the way. They like more of the same. Whereas I'm sort of interested in so many different things and so many different genres. So I've written everything from high epic fantasy to young adults, sort of mythological fantasy, to modern crime. But the book I'm going to talk a little more about now, the one that Janet held up the cover to, Someday I'll Find You, is in a way the book I was always meant to write, I think, and was kind of working up to, writing all these other books almost as training, to get to tell. And I should be clear here, it's not my parents' story. It's my parents' ethos, really. I wanted to tackle something that dealt with a world where kids, effectively, 20-year-olds, have to make a choice whether they're going to run away or whether they're going to stand up and fight. And both my parents made that latter choice. My dad joined the RAF actually 6 months before the war broke out because he knew it was coming. And as he said to me, I was buggered if I was going to get shot in a trench. Also, he had, he was an actor and he knew where the good uniforms were, right? So the RAF, and he became a fighter pilot, Battle of Britain pilot, North African pilot, got shot down in North Africa. If I have time, I'll show you his logbook, which I have out there, which is one of my favorite pieces of research. And my mum had a different story. So I'll tell you a bit about her background first, and then we can go from there. And I think we're saving questions for the end, aren't we, Bill? Is that the plan? Give me the thumbs up if that's true. Yeah. Coffee, very important. So Ingegerd Holter, formerly of Bestum, which I've discovered is close to where Jürgen grew up, and he went to the same high school or preparatory school, perhaps, as my mother in Bestum. It's basically a suburb of Oslo, and she was born into this family of actors. Not something you'd wish on a lot of people, especially when you have a father who's as I suppose narcissistic would be the modern term, as my grandfather Carl was, very self-obsessed about himself and his career. And so he led them a merry dance, the children. He had 4 kids. My mum was the eldest legitimate child. My grandfather was, he lived to all the cliches of being an artist and a writer and an actor by fathering illegitimate children as well as legitimate, many of whom have popped into our life quite recently. And in fact, for you Norwegian fans, I'm going to a family reunion of all us Holters, all descended from these 4 men born around the 1880s, and all the children, and well, there's one child alive from that people's generation. And she was the youngest of the 3rd marriage of my grandfather's younger brother. So she's kind of my mother's generation still. She's only 82. Elizabeth, she's organizing it, and we're going out to the family farm, which is at a place called Vam, which is not far from Oslo. And we had that farm since 1565. And I think one of my grandparents had to sell it because of tax reasons to the Norwegian government. They turned it into a farm museum, and we're allowed to go back and take it over once in a while if we ask nicely. So that's where we're going to meet 100 Holters, all these descendants. So that's going to be fun. That's in August. But yes, so my mum grew up in Oslo. She was very beautiful. And in fact, I'm going to just flick up a picture of her at one early thing that happened to her in 1936, when she was 22 years old. She became, dun dun dun, here you are, Oslo Princess. Can you all see that? Yeah. Janet, give me the thumbs up. I can just see you in the corner there. Yeah. So you can see that Oslo Princess. You know, I talk about it being Miss Oslo. You know, but it's because that's an easier shorthand for it. It's not quite, but she was in many ways the embodiment of Norway. You know, she was beautiful. You can start to see that there. You'll see that more later. She was from a family of oh, sorry, I want to get rid of that one. She was from a family of artists. You know, she was a well-known family, Carl Holter's family. And yes, that was Mum in 1936. There she is on the float with the also-rans, I presume, the maidens, and so that was a big moment for oh, hang on a second, I need to stop the share, don't I? There we go. That was a big moment for my mother. My mother was like all the Holter Humphries. You know, I've inherited and I read recently that there is actually a nomad gene. And I'm sure it's connected with Vikings, because obviously they were the big wanderers. I am a wanderer, just described being in the Balkans. That's one of many trips I've taken in my life. My mum, unusually then for a younger woman, she was very restless. And in 1936, soon after being the princess, boarded a ship with her younger sister, cruised around South America, ended up in New York and hopped ship. And my mum was an illegal immigrant in America for a couple of years. She lived at the Young Women's Christian Association hostel in downtown Manhattan, and worked at the Norwegian legation or the consulate in Manhattan. Her younger sister, Tante Jørgen, she was a nanny, and then they both moved to Washington, where she worked in the Norwegian embassy. I think my mum was. What's that? Someone said something. I don't know. So she worked in the Norwegian embassy in Washington, and then in '38, she was going to stay on as she was applying to be a citizen. But her younger sister was going back to Norway, and at the last moment she decided to go with her and went back to Norway. And then, of course, you know, it's always that thing when you go home after you really want to be away and you're back for 2 weeks having a good time, and then you think, oh no, I'm back here again. And so she decided to abscond again. By this time she was working for a man called Gabriel Smith, and Gabriel Smith, that English sounding name, was actually a Norwegian, and he was in a company called, he and his brother had founded a company called the Bell Shipping Company. And my mum was a very gifted personal assistant, you know, typist, secretary, did all that, and she was his personal assistant, but still quite, she still had the travel bug. So after a while she said, look, I just want to go off again. And he said, well, don't leave me, I'll send you to the London offices. So in '39 she was sent off to London, where she worked for Bell Ships in London for the, you know, in the London branch. And it was in London where she was in 1939, September the 3rd, when Chamberlain made his famous speech. And she would have been sitting in one part of London listening to it on the radio. And my father, who was a young actor at the time, but had spent 6 months training to be a pilot, would have heard Chamberlain announce, we are at war with Germany. My mum decided to go back. I mean, London immediately didn't look like the most hospitable place to be. You know, the sandbags were up, the anti-aircraft guns were out, and her country was neutral. So head back to Norway, which she did. And as we all know from the history, April the 9th, Hitler did not respect Norway's neutrality and invaded. My mum was in Oslo. She talked about how the first she actually knew about it, because any fighting in Oslo had taken place, you know, outside. You probably know that the Norwegian commander at Oscarburg Fortress sunk the Blucher, who was sailing up the fjord. But the first my mum knew about it was looking out her office window in downtown Oslo and seeing a swastika run up at Akersburg, which is the fort in Oslo. Her boss, Gabrielle, immediately said, you know, this shall not pass. You know, I'm going to work with the resistance group, or form a resistance group. Are you in? And she said, absolutely, I'm in. And so she immediately began working for the fragmented Norwegian resistance. What's interesting, and my brother, who's done a lot of research, and he's the one who's put up all those things on the ancestry, which I'm calling up periodically. We think in our research, and the research I did, you know, for my novel, that Mum was actually, or Gabrielle was, and therefore Mum was actually working for SOE, the Special Operations Executive, which I'm sure many of you know about, was what Churchill set up to, as he put it, set Europe ablaze. It was the spies, and it was sort of made up of some sort of oddball people, but they were the ones who were parachuted in. They were the ones who worked with the local groups, did the sabotage, did the assassinations, all that. The reason we think she was probably with them is it was, you know, this will be later in the story, but the speed with which she was got out of Norway when it all went wrong. There's a couple of stories in Norway of what happened with her work. Essentially, she was quite important. She was a liaison, because, as you know, it was they operated on cells, in order to minimize the damage when one cell went down, which they did with extraordinary regularity. As I say in the book, when my character Ilsa is being interviewed by SOE to see if she'll be suitable, and they're telling her about the situation in Norway now, the country under occupation by then, and one of the officers says, your countrymen talk too much, and she says, you got to forgive us. We haven't had a war in 150 years, where it's going to take us time to catch up. So Mum's job was really to act as a bit of a liaison between cells. She also would be a courier for mainly, I believe, and I have to tell you, most of this information was not got from my mother. It's surmised. She told us a bit towards the end of her life, but there were a couple of things. One was she was a spy, right? They don't readily reveal secrets. Two, she would have signed the Official Secrets Act, which, if my mother made a commitment to something, she stuck to it. But we did ascertain that she would run information between different groups. So there was one cell that was tasked with keeping an eye on German shipping movements in the Oslo fjord, for example. What munitions were coming in, what was going out, the submarine pens that were built fairly locally, things like that. And that information would be gathered by one cell, and then it would be encoded. Actually, probably wasn't encoded. Well, it would have been encoded in some way, and then she would carry it on paper. And I read later in my research into SOE that the British designed these wonderful secret compartment bras, which she'd carry the secrets in her bra. And I go back to Miss Oslo, of course. I mean, my mum, of course, Miss Oslo was Aryan beauty personified. The Germans loved her. The Germans thought she was great and were very polite to her. And I mean, obviously, some of them flirted with her and all that. But generally, they thought, oh, this is Norway. This is the Northern European folk that we're fighting for. So she would run this up to she'd meet a red-bearded man at a ruined church on the outside of Oslo. Didn't know his name. Would give him that. He would take it to the radio operators, who were moving around all the time, of course, and they would further encode and send it off to England. So that was her job. Now, just backtracking a bit, she did that job for a year, and I'll talk about what happened in a second. But part of the background of that also was that when Norway was invaded, as you know, they fought for 2 months. Oslo was taken like that, but they fought for 2 months in the valleys and up in the north, particularly around Narvik and all that. Her younger brother, Tord, was another wandering Holter. He'd gone off, joined a whaling fleet when he was 16, traveled all over the world, hopped ship in Argentina, became a gaucho because he was a horseman. When he came back to Europe, the Russians invaded Finland. He joined the Norwegian volunteers, went and fought the Russians in Finland, was on his way back with the horses because he was the horse guy. When the Germans invaded, immediately put on a Norwegian uniform and almost immediately was badly wounded in a fight with the Germans up on the Swedish-Norwegian border. And he was in a hospital in a converted factory up there. And my mother and her younger sister, Tante Jorunn, went up to see him and to try to help. And they were immediately recruited by the doctors, who were looking after German soldiers, Norwegian soldiers, and there were German doctors and Norwegian doctors just working together to look after these boys. And so he'd been shot in the shoulder, but he was all right. It was a bit touch and go, but he was all right. He healed. Her father came, Carl, the controversial one, more controversial he'll become. And then, so that was the first time she'd seen him in a while, because he was living in the countryside by then. The doctors said to them, look, we were thinking of going to try to join the Norwegian forces up near Narvik, but it looks like it's all going to be over soon. So we're going to hop across the border to Sweden. and you know, and work for the Norwegians there and try to get to England. So they asked them to go, the two sisters to go. Mum's younger sister, Tante Joran, went with them. My mother pleaded that she couldn't go. She had work to do in Oslo. She had a boyfriend. My mother did have a boyfriend. She liked boyfriends she had a lot of boyfriends in the cavalry for some reason. She enjoyed the cavalry officers. But the real reason, of course, she couldn't go was she was a spy in Oslo. So she went back to Oslo and continued with her work. Now, here's where the controversial stuff arises. And this is something I depict in the book. This is something that's very closely related to my family. Her father, Karl, was half German, had won many writing awards in Germany. He'd gone to Berlin in 1936 because he'd won this award for a play called Ice Folk, which depicted hardy Northern Europeans. It was very popular in Germany, and shaken Goering's hand while he was there. Karl, as he said, he signed up with the Norwegians to fight the invaders. Oh, God, who's that? No. I'm so sorry. Just one second there. Sorry. That was Sharon calling, Alma. Alma? That was Sharon calling. You might want to call her back. I'm so sorry. I've got a friend staying here who's needing to depart the island today, and someone just called me there. So where was I? Oh yeah. So Karl, you know, as I say, he claimed to be fighting, but he didn't actually do any fighting. And then, of course, he joined the Norwegian Nazi Party, Quisling's party. And, you know, and I'm not going to make any sort of excuses for him. You know, his daughters, all his family, and us still believe. But what I also am interested in is the ambiguity of war. Many people made many choices based on things that happened then that we struggle now to see, you know. And so I do write about what might drive someone like Karl, who was very educated, you know, and as far as we know, it wasn't about anti-Semitism. It was about Northern Europeans. He was a great student of history and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, it sounds like I'm making excuses, but I'm not really. But he made his choices, and my mum hadn't seen him for many months, and he suddenly shows up in Oslo. This is probably in maybe May or June of 1940, and so, you know, the maybe slightly later, because the war was over, and Mum was at her office in Oslo in the harbour there, and Karl suddenly shows up, and he's come from the countryside, and he arrives in her office, and he puts down a grease-proof paper wrapped package, and she says, "What's that?" And he says, "It's butter. I brought you butter from the farm." Now, they hadn't seen butter in Oslo since April the 9th. And she looked at him and she said, "Is it true, Father, that you've joined the Nazi Party?" And he said, "Well, yes, because, you know," and he started to talk about it, and she just shoved the package back at him and said, "Take your butter back, Father," which were the last words she spoke to him for 7 years. Kicked him out of the office. Karl is another story. I go into it a bit in my book, in that the character of Wilhelm, Ilse's father in the book, is like Karl, a propagandist. He's a writer. He writes basically propaganda for the Nazi Norwegians, you know, writing in the newspapers, articles favoring the Germans. He also, Karl, not my character in the book, was what they would call, they didn't call it that then, but he was embedded with the Norwegian Legion at the siege of Leningrad. So he was up there in uniform, writing reports about our brave lads fighting the Bolsheviks, because to many Norwegians, that's what it was about: Bolshevism, fighting the, you know, ancient enmities, fighting the Slav, right? Wilhelm doesn't do that. Wilhelm's in Oslo the entire time, and in my book, unlike in the history, Ilse, the spy who's sent back into Oslo, into Norway to work, to be deep undercover, lives with her father. who she loves. He's lovable in many ways, but he's also her enemy, and she betrays him essentially every day, him and his cause. My mum didn't live with Carl in Oslo. So after a year, which was a good run for a Norwegian resistance group, her cell was busted. Someone talked, someone blabbed, and her boss, the first she knew was she showed up at that church to meet the red-bearded man, and he didn't show up. So she was told, if that happens, don't go home. And so she didn't. She went to a safe house. They told her, yep, your cell's busted. Your boss is already on his way out of Norway. He I think went something that Janet talks about in her books, the Shetland bus. He took that, the trawlers that used to go. But Mum was told to hightail it to Sweden, and so she was told don't take a suitcase. Take the local train down to the near border of Sweden, and she was. They said, don't take a suitcase. Don't look like you're traveling. So she in her handbag, she put an extra pair of high heel shoes and a folded Norwegian flag, and that was basically her luggage. And she arrived in the border town. She was met by the local resistance, who put her with a farmer overnight. She woke up before dawn to find the farmer making a 6-egg omelette, which he forced her to eat. And my mum was yes, they were already under privations, but my mum had been a model. She watched her her intake. And I said, she's got to do that. He said, you don't know whether the Germans are going to get you or not, and when you're going to eat again. So you're eating this omelette. Then he put her on a bicycle and cycled down to the border with her, and she cycled across into Sweden. Supposedly, and this is the slightly blurry story here, because again, why was my mother not immediately interned? That's what they were doing to Norwegians crossing the border in 1941. The story is that maybe she met a policeman who recognized her, or she was able to tell him a convincing enough story, because she then went on to Stockholm and reported to the Norwegian legation, the government in exile, of course, and was immediately told that her boss was either on his way, or I think he'd already made London, and like all bosses with very competent secretaries, was unable to do anything without her. So she needed to get to London immediately. In those days, there were 2 flights from Stockholm to London. One was run by the Royal Air Force, and one was run by the Norwegian Air Force. And they used to fly, from Stockholm to Lukars in Scotland, which was the point of immigration. So not many seats went every week to Stockholm, to the UK. My mum supposedly got a seat on the Norwegian flight and was due to fly, and she arrived at the airport only to be told that her seat was cancelled. And there was no reason. You've been struck off. What transpired, as she found out later in London, I'll tell you how she got there in a minute, was that Trygve Lie, it's a name some of you might know. He was the first Secretary General of the UN, in fact, after the war, Norwegian foreign minister at the time, in exile in London. He was looking at the manifests of all the people who were meant to be flying in from Stockholm, and he went, who the hell's Ingegerd Holter? I need my ministers here. There were all these ministers waiting to come over, so he struck her off the list. So my mum went back, quite upset, to the legation, and they said, right, well, we're probably going to have to send you out via Russia in May of 1941. Now, some of you will always remember what happened in early June of 1941, which was, of course, Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia by Germany. So if my mum had gone out then, she might have been caught in Moscow. Fortunately, they got in touch with her. They said, they've got you a flight on the RAF flight end of this week. So my mum shows up at the airport again, and she goes up to the RAF officer. This elegant Brit is standing there in his uniform. And she says, I'm Ingegerd Holter. Oh, yes, Fruken Holter. we've got you on the list here. And she was a little nervous. She said, well, you know, I was meant to fly last week with the Norwegians. I mean, are you sure I'm okay to fly? And he looked at her and he said, Fruken Holter, this is the Royal Air Force. And if we choose to fly a hurry, a Hottentot, or a halter, we shall. I mean, who says things like that? I mean, really? A Hottentot, for goodness sake. Anyway, on the plane she goes, and she gets to Norway, to Lukars, and there's a couple of things I can show you here. Where are we? Yes, let me share this on the screen. This is the guest book when you fly into Lukars in Fife in Scotland, 30th of August 1941, and she flew in, and here are all the people, and this is her here. If you can see, she's the third one down, Ingegerd Holter, signed in, and her address, Jürgen will have to correct my pronunciation, I always get this one wrong, Bygde Allé, number 24. And you can see there's a guy from the Royal Norwegian Army, there's a naval attaché, Stockholm, there's Ingegerd Holter just with an address. She wasn't obviously going to put spy there. But yeah, so that's how my mum got to England. And again, she was speeded through and got down to London quite fast and arrived in time for some big celebration, Norwegian celebration. And she basically didn't, I think, you know, she just arrived with a handbag, right? So, but she went to the Norwegian embassy and the government in exile. And there was Trygve Lie, the man who denied her passage. And he was so apologetic. He hadn't realized, it just was something that had slipped his mind. And so he said, can I make it up to you? We're having this big celebration tonight. And and she said, well, I don't have any clothes. He said, you're the same size as my daughter. She's staying at Claridge's. You can spend the night with her and come to the celebration. So my mum's first night in London was champagne and caviar, maybe not caviar, but champagne certainly, at Claridge's Hotel in London. So her story after that is that she went into uniform. They obviously weren't going to send her back to Norway. She was too prominent. She knew too much, knew too many groups. And she'd also said to them, she said to Gabrielle when he recruited her, she said, I'll join you, but I promise you that if I'm arrested, I will tell them everything straight away. I won't be tortured. And which is fair enough, really, her first condition. So that's what, so anyway, they weren't going to send her back. So she went into uniform, and let me just pull up a copy of her, because this is I think it's an extraordinary photograph that was taken a little later. Let me share the screen again. Here she is. There she is, my mum at war. I love this photograph. I don't know how closely you can see it. There's just a look in her eye, I think, of sheer determination, which was my mum. She was determined. It's also to me, it looks like someone saying, you know, Hitler, I'm coming for you. It's one of those. It's, I'm a little confused about why she's wearing one glove only and she's holding the other one. I don't know, maybe that was a pose they adopted in those days, but yeah, and then you can see her hat, Norsk Marine, so that's the Norwegian Army. Sorry, Norwegian Navy. Where are we? Have I stopped the sharing? Yes, I'm back, aren't I? Yeah. So she worked in Norwegian Naval Intelligence in London, and everyone was being trained to take Norway back. So my very fashion model type mother was, was down and dirty with firing small cannon and machine guns, and she was always off on courses to do things like that. During this time, and it's not something it's not something I depict in the book directly, but you know, my mum was very beautiful, and she had an affair with the man who was the assistant head of the Norwegian Air Force in England for 2 years. Very passionate, and they loved each other dearly. And it all went wrong, as these things tend to do. Partly because he was married and had a wife and family in Norway, who he supposedly was not. It was leaving, and then it didn't happen. Anyway, that's another story. It's not the story I depict in the book either. But I think what was interesting for me writing the book was, as I say, you know, not depicting their literal truths, but depicting a kind of ethos of who these people were. Both Billy, who's the pilot, who I'll talk about again in a bit, the RAF fighter pilot, and Ilse, who is based on my mum. 2 years later, my mum, by now free, she meets up. She goes to Scotland on leave with her younger sister, and there in a hotel, she meets this gentleman. You, why aren't you coming? Yeah, there we go. Flight Lieutenant.
Oh my God.
Peter Cecil Humphries, rather dashing chap.
No
Actor,
kidding.
of course, the Brill Cream boy. As you can see, the Brill Cream around there. This photo was taken and then sent to my grandfather, who was starring on Broadway at the time, and he then had a painting made of it, which my brother now has, which is rather lovely. But anyway, so my mother's first glimpse of my father was he was with his mother, who was a very elegant actress called Gladys Mason. She acted as, but Gladys Humphries, and they got on very well. And my mother sort of looked across the dining room of the hotel in Scotland and said, "Oh, she must be a very rich lady to have such a handsome young gigolo with her." That was her first take on my father. Anyway, this misunderstanding was quickly cleared up. He proposed after 3 days, and they were married 5 weeks later in London.
So romantic.
Yes, yeah. And so they were married at the in the I think the Chelsea Registry Office, and then had their reception at the Savoy Hotel. Noel Coward, the famous English playwright, who my father had flown around the Middle East at one stage, because I'll talk a bit about my father in a second, his career. But when he moved into Transport Command, he flew Noel Coward around, who of course knew Cecil Humphries, Peter's father, my grandfather, and so Noel Coward became a friend and showed up at the wedding fashionably late with 2 bottles of champagne. In London in September 1944, must have been quite hard to acquire. So, yep, they married.
I know your brother Alan wrote that how this cell was destroyed. They actually end up kind of killing the radio operator by dragging him downstairs. And can you say more about what she found out later about her cell, or she ever?
I actually don't know. I know that story. I know they caught the radio operator in the attic of a house and dragged him down 5 flights by his heels, and killed it. That killed him. Fractured his skull. I mean, you know, I don't. There isn't that much more I can tell you about that, about the busting of the cell. I did want to tell you something more. There's another little story, and I'm definitely, don't worry, I'll leave plenty of time for questions. But there's another little story to do with my cousin. I told you about my cousin Elizabeth, my second cousin, my mother's cousin Elizabeth, who's still alive, who's the youngest of those Holter generation, because she was the young daughter of the 3rd marriage of the younger brother of Carl. So she's still alive. And when I was in Oslo, Christmas before last, she presented me with something from her cousin, so my mother's cousin as well, Arna, who was a Norwegian Spitfire pilot. who died in Holland in 1944. In November the 4th, I think, 1944. He was strafing a German railway junction and got blown out of the sky. I mean, literally blown out of the sky. They found this out because archaeologists have gone back in and assembled all these pieces of Spitfire, which were aluminum by then. And she presented me with one, which was amazing. And then told me the whole story of Arna. And let me just share that. It pops up. See what Arna is. Yeah, here he is. So Arna had trained in what they called Little Norway, which was outside in Muskoka, outside not far from Toronto, and then had joined and been sent over. And I think he only arrived in England in September, and then he was flying in November and was killed almost immediately. But what's fascinating was that there was a Dutch girl there who, well, a Dutch woman actually, she was 22, and he was shot down near a monastery where she was sheltering with her young daughter. And she saw this happen and was determined to honor this unknown man who'd given his life. And so she went out and basically with some of the monks, and I think even a couple of the Germans who were there, collected what body parts she could find, which were basically fit into a shoebox, and buried them. And then after the war, the RAF knew where he'd gone down, and his parents came and visited and paid for a slightly better grave to be erected. And then some years later, this story was found out and was talked about quite a bit. And so they created, they built this at the actual spot, which is, can you see that? It's his grave. Arne Helle Holter, fighter pilot, Norwegian Air Force, born at Brevik, Norway, killed in action, 4th of November, 1944. And there's his picture. And this was broadcast in or publicized by this Norwegian student who found out the story, a journalism student. And they have these ceremonies there now. Jens Stoltenberg actually attended one about 5 years ago. He was the head of NATO. So, but yeah, that was, and she gave me, and unfortunately, I just took it into storage. I should have dug it out for this, but she gave me a piece of his Spitfire because there was a Dutch guy who went around and collected all the pieces. And each piece, this twisted piece of metal, has the serial number of the plane. So they were able to track it back to him. Anyway, that's that story. More questions?
Well, I had a question. I was curious about the flight from Sweden to Scotland. Did your mother ever describe the nature of the flight? You know, how dangerous it was or how long it was?
I never heard her talk about that. I think, from what I can tell, I don't think any of them were shot down. You know, because Sweden was allowed to send, you know, because they were a neutral country. My next book is actually going to be dealing with what happened in Sweden during the war. But even though this was technically an RAF flight, I think it was a civilian airline. They put it under technically like BOAC or something like that. So for whatever reason, the Germans didn't attack those planes. Yeah. So, but I don't know other than her arriving and then being sped through, because a lot of people were interned straight away until they were examined. But of course, my mum came with credentials, so.
Very interesting story. I just one of the Noel Coward connection is fascinating because he was, if I understand my British history, he was one of the most popular persons at that time. If you were going to have a random person show up in a novel, you'd probably pick him.
Yeah, well, I don't actually put him in the novel, but I put obviously his song, "Someday I'll Find You," at least the title of it.
And I found that connection interesting because that was sort of really the man around town. But what, if you would say, what do you think the bravest thing your mother and your father did during the war? The thing that required the most courage or dedication?
No, I don't think there's a single incident for my mother. I think, what I talk about in the book as well, obviously doing extensive research into the world of spying, and one of the army officers said, you do not underestimate the stress of what you're going to be going into, because it's, you're going to be in deep cover and all that, but this is simultaneously really dull and always dangerous. You cannot know when you wake up, and that I suppose was the continuous act of courage, was my mother waking up every morning not certain that she wasn't going to end up the night in a Nazi torture cell. So I think the courage to carry on, that was what I would say was for her. For my father, I mean, I do depict it in the book, the dogfight and all that. I can't imagine what the terror must have been like to go up against the Messerschmitts, to actually fight in a dogfight. I mean, I think my father, there was never, they didn't, as people of that generation didn't talk about it, really. My father would talk about the glory side, because he was an actor and a storyteller. So he would talk about, oh yeah, sure, chased home by Messerschmitts and all that, but not the terror and not the legacy it left him with. Definitely, they didn't call it this, but PTSD for sure, which played out in various ways in his life, of course. But that courage, being able to stand up and go out there when they called scramble, you're up in the air and you're being shot at by Germans.
One of the things that interests me is that after the war, a lot of Norwegians were active in providing help and relief for the Germans, who were very bad off after the war, and which quite honestly impressed me. That's not the first reaction I would have, given what Norway went through during the war. But did your parents ever express attitudes toward Germany that you remember after the war, or?
Yeah, I do. I remember something quite clearly, and I was quite a young kid at the time. But my mother would not ride in a German car for 20 years after the war. She wouldn't get into a Mercedes. Not that the opportunity presented itself that much, I would think, but if it did, she wouldn't. And my father was like, "Oh, come on, car." But it was very, very different wars for the two of them. My father could look at some of the glory of it all. My mother, it wasn't glorious at all. She had friends. She lost friends who were killed by the Germans. And so I think that was the big difference between them. My mum was a very contained person. She didn't talk a lot about stuff. As I say, she hardly talked about the war. We've had to find out all sorts of stuff since. Yeah, that was something that was, and my mum wasn't a hater, really, but for a long time. And then that eased, and when she moved to Spain, of course, there were a lot of Germans down there, and she spoke fluent German, very well educated. They learned their languages well. So she spoke, actually, her German was better than her English during the war, until she got to England and brushed it up.
Chris, you mentioned about that Stockholmsuten, and that's the flight between England and Sweden. So I happened to, my dad was in the Air Force after the war. He was in Linge during the war, so he was also part of my. So there's this big book. And then when you said there were no losses, I was like, no, there were some losses. So
there were.
Quickly, yeah. So they lost 11 planes actually.
There you go. Thank you for telling me. Yeah, I didn't know that.
And there was also an agreement, because the Norwegian flights were not covered by that agreement. And so they didn't use lights. The Swedish planes had the lights on so they could be seen, but even so, 2 of them were shot down.
Ah,
But night fighters were out there, and they probably surmised also might be trying to trick us or something. So
right. Interesting. Yeah. So thanks. I did not know that. But I don't know that much. I don't use that aspect, so it's not something I've researched. So.
Unfortunately, the book is only Norwegian, so it's.
Well.
I don't know. Maybe if you speak Norwegian.
I don't. Unfortunately, my brother speaks fluent Norwegian because that was his first language. My father went to Canada. My mother worked at the embassy, so she brought a young cousin over to be the au pair, the nanny. And so all my brother spoke was Norwegian. So much to my father's annoyance, when my brother shows up in Canada finally, 3 years old, he can't speak English.
We had something similar. We lived 5 years in England. My wife is US, and she knew a little bit Norwegian, but not much. And when we lived in England, our 2 kids went to Norwegian school in England. So if they wanted to talk without mommy understanding, they spoke Norwegian.
There you are.
Not very happy about it for obvious reasons.
Oh.
Chris, you said your mom worked at the Norwegian intelligence in London. Did you research that to understand what that was about?
I did a bit. I mean, she was with Naval Intelligence, which was based in the Haymarket, actually. But Norway House was the sort of center, which is still there. You've probably seen it. It's an amazing building. And I put a couple of scenes, one inside and one outside it, because it's actually annoyingly a Thai restaurant now. Down below, it's a Thai restaurant, but the whole the frontage, stonework, there's a big Norwegian lion, with the crown and on the shield above the door, and all that. So aside from looking at Norway House and stuff, I didn't learn a lot about what my mum talked about being based at the Haymarket in an office there.
If they have, because when I lived in London, the Norwegian House was still the Norwegian Club. Yeah, so for people like me who was working in England, we were members. And at that stage, and I was very sorry when I heard they had to leave it, because they still had the 2 royal chairs, the chair Kong Haakon used and then Crown Prince Olaf. And so it was a little bit of sort of so we had a good time there. But then I heard we left in 97, and I think a couple of years later they had to sell it. And
what a pity.
Yeah, I think they joined with the Swedish or Danish club or something. I'm not certain, but I heard something.
Right. Oh, that is a pity, isn't it? Yeah. It's a beautiful. I mean, I still love that bill. I was standing outside it about 4 months ago, looking at it again. I like the idea of it.
Intriguing and fascinating family history. Thanks for sharing that. I wonder if anyone is aware of the extent of Nazi spies in the London theater, if you will, at the same time.
I didn't know that was a thing. Spies in London theatre.
Well, no, I mean arena.
Theatre of war.
Yeah.
Theatre of war. I thought you meant I'm an actor, right? I thought you meant theatre. Well, from what I've read, and again, it wasn't my, I tend to do research on a need to know basis, and so it wasn't. But of course, you read widely as well. The Nazis didn't have a very good track record of spies in England. They were caught pretty fast, and then executed pretty fast. Actually, nearly all of them, or if they could be turned, they were. So I mean, there's going to be books you can read on it, I'm sure. But as far as I understand, they weren't very successful at all. No, the Nazi spies in London.
Of course, it didn't help that Admiral Canaris, who was head of the German military intelligence, was an anti-Nazi. He couldn't stand Hitler, and he was executed in 1944.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, because in my novel, I wanted to deal with that side. I didn't want to represent Germans as universally evil. You know, I'm interested in the ambiguity, as I say, and so I created this sort of. He's a third major character in the book called Klaus von Rennenberg, and he's an Abwehr operative in Oslo. He's a major in Oslo, and he was wounded on that same flight coming back from leading the Pathfinders in to light up London for the incendiary bombers to come in. So that all the characters are kind of tied in by that flight, that raid.
Another thing you could add about that is that the first proofs they had about the Germans building, you know, the rocket program with V1 and V2 was from their spies or the network in Norway. And the papers were apparently, we don't know who did it, but they were handed over by somebody at German embassy. So it wasn't the brilliant British operation. It was they actually had somebody there who, you know, didn't want the Nazis to win. And they apparently, from what I read, unless they found it last maybe 5-10 years, but when I looked at it, they still don't know who it is. There's a lot of theories, of course, which you would expect. So you can be very you have full freedom there to come up.
Good. Well, I like that. I like it when it's a bit fuzzy, because then you can just sort of go, well, you know, maybe that happened, you know. So yeah, interesting.
And just curious about what's your process of writing? What type of, do you have a schedule that you write when you want to, or do you discipline yourself to write 2 hours a day, or what's your writing system, if you have one?
Well, I'm in that system right now, in fact, because I've taken quite a lot of time off from writing. I'm not a daily writer. I'm a project writer. And then once I start on a project, you have to, you know, you have to drive me from my office where you see me now with hounds. You know, I just can't stop. Which is one of the reasons I always take a bit of time to get going. I will be diving into this book in the next week or so. What I do is I do quite a lot of obviously preparatory research, which gives me a general story, and then I start writing down, you know, research ideas. This could be useful or whatever, and then I will write in my my notebook. This is the new notebook. This has got research in it, and I'll write. You know, I'll have an idea of the story. Well, I had to pitch the story to my publishers, because someday I'll find you did really well in Canada. It just last week crested 10,000 copies sold, which is big in Canada. And so they immediately wanted more of the same, but not a sequel. So they don't like sequels for whatever reason. So I'm doing this war story. It's called The Further Education of Eve Sinclair. It's going to be mainly set in Sweden. And spy romance again. So I'm doing all the preliminary reading. And then I was just in Vancouver. There's an amazing bookstore in Vancouver, one of the best secondhand bookstores in the world. It's completely ramshackle, piles of books everywhere, but he has everything. And so I found a load of spy books, a load of different ones that I'm going to be reading in the next 10 days or so, to just give myself a bit of a grounding. And then I'll dive in. And when this is what I teach, actually. I teach creative writing quite a bit now as well. And I always talk about my process, which is to, you know enough to get yourself going, and then just go. And then what you write will tell you more about what you need to research. So I still like books to begin with, but I have to say the computer's great. You know, when Billy's having a pint in the Red Lion in St. James in London, I needed to know how much it would cost him in 1943. So our friend Google told me. I'd have miled. So that it's ongoing. You know, the research then becomes ongoing, and I use it. But I always say, you know, when I teach it, that research is not really about. I mean, it is about detail. getting details right, of course, because people will pick you up. People like Jürgen know much more about World War II than I do, probably. So they will catch you out, right? And it's, you know, it's not that there's not many of them. What terrifies people writing historical fiction is often, oh my God, what if I get it wrong? You know, and there's not this panel of experts out there waiting to trip you up, right? You'll get occasional emails, but mostly people just want a good, well-realized story. And you do obviously try to get it right, because if something egregious happens, you know, you'll throw the reader out of the story. Your compact with the reader is that you're going to create a world that's true, recognizably true. That doesn't mean it's 100% accurate all the time, because you just can't do it. You can't know, right? Janet's books are very detailed and very well grounded, but as are mine. So the important thing for me about research is that, yes, it's get the details right, know how a RAF coat would have hung, what insignia Abwehr officer would have worn, that sort of thing, but also use each fact as a springboard for the imagination.